Rome was never supposed to last. It had no natural advantages, no legendary beginning, and no reason to dominate the ancient world. And yet it did. For centuries, Rome ruled millions of people across 3 continents, shaping how power, law, and society functioned. Then it collapsed, or at least that is how the story is usually told. But Rome's true legacy does not lie in its armies or its emperors. It lies in the systems it created, systems so effective that they survived the empire itself. Long after Rome's political power vanished, its ideas continued to govern the world. Rome was not just a place. It was a way of organizing power, and once that way was created, it could not be undone. This is not only the story of Rome's fall, it is the story of how one city reshaped civilization and why its influence never truly disappeared. Rome did not begin as an empire. It began as a small and fragile settlement beside a river, surrounded by enemies and constantly at risk of destruction. In its earliest days, there was nothing extraordinary about it. No vast resources, no powerful armies, no destiny that set it apart. Yet over centuries, Rome achieved what no other civilization had before. It conquered rivals stronger than itself, absorbed foreign cultures instead of destroying them, and built a system that could control vast territories for generations. At its height, the Roman Empire ruled nearly a quarter of the world's population, stretching from the mist-covered lands of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, and from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Persia. Rome's greatest strength was not its legions, nor its emperors. It was its system, a system of law that promised order, an army built on discipline rather than individual heroism, and an administration that turned conquered lands into functioning parts of the empire. Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it transformed them. Their roads became Roman roads, their laws became Roman law, their identities slowly merged into the empire itself. But the same system that built Rome also carried the seeds of its destruction. As Rome grew richer and more powerful, ambition replaced duty. Loyalty shifted from the state to individual leaders. Corruption weakened institutions, and political violence became routine. Rome was no longer threatened only from outside its borders. It was being undone from within. What followed was not a single dramatic collapse, but a long and complex decline. Civil wars, economic instability, plagues, and invasions slowly eroded Rome's strength. Over time, the empire lost not just territory, but confidence in its own future. And yet, even after Rome fell, it did not disappear. Its laws shaped modern justice. Its language shaped civilizations. Its ideas about power, governance, and citizenship survived long after its emperors were gone. Rome collapsed as a political empire, but it endured as an idea. To understand Rome is to understand how civilizations rise, how they sustain power, and how they ultimately decline. This is the complete story of Rome, from a forgotten settlement to an immortal legacy, and it begins at the very beginning. 753 to 509 BC. The story of Rome begins long before it became an empire, and even before it became a republic. It begins with the legend that the Romans themselves believed explained who they were and why their city was different from all others. According to tradition, Rome was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus. They were said to be born into a royal bloodline, abandoned as infants, and left to die beside the river Tiber. Instead, they survived, raised by a she-wolf, until they were discovered and taken in by shepherds. To modern historians, this story is myth rather than fact, yet its importance lies not in its accuracy but in its meaning. The legend tells us that Romans believed their city was forged through struggle, survival, and violence. Even in their own imagination, Rome was not born peacefully. It was born through conflict, and that belief would shape Roman attitudes toward power for centuries. The legend ends with tragedy. As the brothers grew older and decided to build a city, a dispute over leadership turned deadly. Romulus killed Remus and became the sole ruler. Rome, according to its own founding story, began with the murder of a brother. From the very beginning, the Romans accepted a harsh truth. Power demanded sacrifice, and authority was often taken, not given. Beyond myth, geography played a decisive role in Rome's early success. The settlement grew along the river Tiber, positioned safely inland from pirate attacks, but close enough to the sea to trade with the wider Mediterranean world. The surrounding hills provided natural defences, while fertile lands supported agriculture. Rome also sat at a crossroads of central Italy, making it an ideal point of control for a movement between northern and southern regions. Rome did not become strong by chance. Its location allowed it to survive when other settlements failed. While stronger neighbours fought each other, Rome endured, adapted, and slowly expanded its influence. In its earlier centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. Tradition remembers 7 kings in total, some wise, some cruel, and some remembered more for legend than fact. These kings laid the foundations of Roman society. They organized armies, established religious traditions, built roads, and created early laws. Under their rule, Rome grew from a scattered village into an organized city-state. But monarchy carried an inherent danger. Power rested in the hands of a single man, and when that man ruled through fear, the entire system collapsed. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, embodied everything the Romans came to hate about kingship. His reign was marked by arrogance, brutality, and the abuse of power. When his family committed acts that shocked Roman society, public anger turned into rebellion. In 509 BC, the Roman people expelled Tarquin and abolished the monarchy altogether. This moment marked one of the most important turning points in Roman history. The Romans did not merely remove a ruler, they rejected the idea of kingship itself. They swore that no man would ever again rule Rome as king. In place of monarchy, they created a new form of government known as the Roman Republic. Power was divided among elected officials, authority was limited by law, and leadership became temporary rather than permanent. This system was designed not to create equality, but to prevent tyranny. The fear of absolute power shaped every part of the republic structure. Rome was still small, and it was still surrounded by hostile neighbours, but it had discovered something more durable than kings or legends. It had created a system that valued discipline, shared authority, and loyalty to the state, above loyalty to any single man. This system would allow Rome not only to survive but to expand, and in the centuries that followed, it would transform a small city on the banks of the Tiber into the dominant power of the ancient world. With the monarchy gone and the republic in place, Rome now faced its greatest challenge yet, proving that a city without kings could still grow, fight, and dominate. From 509 to 264 BC. The fall of the Roman kings did not make Rome powerful overnight. In fact, it made the city more vulnerable than ever. Surrounded by enemies and stripped of a central ruler, Rome now faced a dangerous experiment. Could a city govern itself without a king and still survive? The answer would define Rome's future. The Roman Republic was built on fear, specifically the fear of tyranny. Power was deliberately divided so that no single individual could dominate the state. 2 consuls were elected each year to lead the government and command the army, ensuring that authority was shared and temporary. Alongside them stood the Senate, an assembly of elite families whose influence shaped Roman politics for generations. This system was not democratic in the modern sense. Most Romans had little real power, and political authority remained concentrated among wealthy aristocrats known as patricians. Beneath them were the plebeians, the majority of the population, farmers, soldiers, and labourers who carried the burden of war, but enjoyed few political rights. This imbalance created tension from the very beginning. For decades, Rome was plagued by internal struggle between patricians and plebeians. The lower classes demanded protection from debt, fair treatment under the law, and a voice in government. Rather than collapsing into chaos, Rome adapted. Gradually, plebeians gained representation, legal protections, and access to political offices. These reforms did not create equality, but they prevented revolution. Rome survived because it learned to compromise. While internal conflicts shaped Roman politics, constant warfare shaped Roman identity. The Republic existed in a hostile world where survival depended on strength. Rome fought neighbouring Latin tribes, Etruscan cities, and Italic rivals, often against enemies more experienced and better equipped. Yet Rome possessed a critical advantage: discipline. Roman soldiers were not elite warriors driven by individual glory. They were citizens bound by duty to the state. The Roman army emphasized training, organization, and obedience. Defeat was treated not as a disaster, but as a lesson. Rome lost battles, but it rarely lost wars. Equally important was Rome's approach to conquest. Unlike many ancient powers, Rome did not simply destroy its enemies. Defeated communities were often absorbed into the Roman system, granted partial rights, and expected to provide soldiers. This policy turned former enemies into allies, and steadily expanded Rome's manpower. War strengthened the Republic rather than weakening it. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Rome had emerged as the dominant power in central Italy. Roads connected its territories, alliances secured its borders, and its armies grew more experienced with each campaign. Rome was no longer just defending itself, it was expanding deliberately. But with expansion came responsibility. Rome now governed diverse peoples with different customs, languages, and loyalties. Managing this growing network required organization, law, and administration. Slowly, Rome began to resemble something new, not merely a city-state, but a regional power. By 264 BC, Rome stood at a crossroads. It controlled most of the Italian peninsula and possessed the strongest army in the region. Yet beyond Italy lay greater powers, richer lands, and more dangerous enemies. Rome's next challenge would push the Republic beyond familiar borders and into a struggle for dominance over the Mediterranean world. The Republic had risen. Now it would face the world. Rome had mastered Italy, but Italy was only the beginning. Beyond its shores waited rivals who would test Rome's strength and nearly destroy it. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome had achieved something extraordinary. It dominated the Italian peninsula, commanded the loyalty of allies, and possessed the strongest army in the region. But Rome's power had grown so large that it could no longer remain isolated. Expansion brought Rome into contact with a rival unlike any it had faced before. That rival was Carthage. Carthage was not a city-state like Rome. It was a wealthy maritime empire, built on trade, naval power, and overseas colonies. Founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier, Carthage controlled much of the western Mediterranean, including North Africa, parts of Spain, and key islands such as Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Where Rome ruled on land, Carthage ruled the sea. Conflict between the two powers was inevitable. The spark came in Sicily, an island of immense strategic value. In 264 BC, Rome intervened in a local dispute, drawing itself into direct confrontation with Carthage. What began as a limited conflict quickly escalated into the First Punic War, the largest war the Mediterranean world had ever seen. Rome faced a serious disadvantage. It had no navy capable of matching Carthage's experienced fleets, yet Rome responded in the way it always had, by adapting. Roman engineers copied Carthaginian ship designs and introduced a device called the corvas, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into infantry combat. By transforming sea battles into land fights, Rome played to its strengths. After more than 2 decades of brutal warfare, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily and pay massive indemnity. For the first time, Rome possessed overseas territory. The Republic had crossed a psychological threshold. It was no longer just a regional power. It was an imperial one. But peace did not bring stability. Humiliated and weakened, Carthage sought recovery under a new generation of leaders, most notably a general named Hamilcar Barca. He expanded Carthaginian influence in Spain, building wealth and military strength while quietly preparing for revenge. His son, Hannibal, would inherit this mission. In 218 BC, Hannibal launched one of the most daring military campaigns in history. Rather than attacking Rome by sea, he led an army from Spain across southern Gaul and over the Alps, bringing war directly into Italy. The journey cost him thousands of men and animals, but those who survived were hardened and loyal. Rome was unprepared for what followed. At battles such as Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, Hannibal annihilated Roman armies. At Cannae alone, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. For the first time, Rome faced the possibility of total destruction, yet Rome did not surrender. Instead of seeking decisive battle, Roman leaders adopted a strategy of endurance. They avoided open confrontation, harassed Hannibal's forces, and relied on their vast reserves of manpower. Rome refused to negotiate, refused to panic, and refused to accept defeat. While Hannibal remained trapped in Italy, Rome struck back elsewhere. Roman armies invaded Spain and eventually carried the war to North Africa itself. Under the leadership of Scipio Africanus, Rome defeated Carthaginian forces and forced Hannibal to return home. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Rome finally defeated Hannibal. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its military power was shattered, and its independence was reduced to little more than a formality. Rome had survived its greatest external threat. But Rome was no longer satisfied with survival. Over the following decades, suspicion and fear toward Carthage hardened into hostility. Roman leaders believed that as long as Carthage existed, Rome would never be safe. This belief culminated in the Third Punic War. In 146 BC, after a brutal siege, Roman forces captured Carthage. The city was systematically destroyed. Its population was killed or enslaved, and its territory absorbed into Roman control. Carthage, once Rome's equal, was erased from history. The destruction of Carthage marked a turning point. Rome now stood unrivaled in the Western Mediterranean. No enemy remained that could challenge its power on an equal footing. Yet victory came at a cost. The Punic Wars transformed Rome's economy, society, and military. Vast wealth flooded into the Republic, along with slaves, land, and political influence. Generals returned as heroes. Loyal armies followed their commanders rather than the state, and inequality deepened between rich and poor. Rome had conquered the world beyond Italy, but in doing so, it had planted the seeds of internal conflict that would soon threaten the Republic itself. Rome had defeated its greatest enemy. Now it faced a new danger, one that came not from abroad, but from within its own society. The destruction of Carthage marked Rome's greatest victory, but it also marked the beginning of its greatest crisis. For the first time in its history, Rome stood without a rival. The Mediterranean world lay open before it, and unimaginable wealth began flowing into the Republic. Gold, land, slaves, and power. They flooded Rome at a scale the Republic was never designed to handle. Conquest transformed Roman society. Victorious generals returned home with enormous fortunes, while tens of thousands of enslaved people were brought into Italy to work farms, mines, and households. Large estates, known as latifundia, replaced small family farms. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few elite families, while ordinary Roman citizens struggled to survive. The Republic had been built on the idea of the citizen soldier, farmers who fought in wars and returned home to their land. But now those farmers were being displaced. Long military campaigns kept them away from their fields, and when they returned, many found their farms ruined or seized by wealthy landowners. Unable to compete with slave-run estates, they drifted into the city of Rome, unemployed and desperate. Inequality grew rapidly, and with it, unrest. Political leaders could no longer ignore the growing divide between rich and poor. Some attempted reform. In the 2nd century BC, the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, proposed land redistribution to restore opportunities for ordinary citizens. Their efforts challenged the power of the Senate, and they threatened elite interests. Both brothers were murdered. Their deaths sent a clear message. Political violence had become an acceptable tool in Roman politics. The Republic's traditions were eroding, replaced by fear and force. As social tension increased, another transformation quietly reshaped Rome. The army changed. Reforms introduced by the general Gaius Marius allowed landless citizens to join the legions. Soldiers were now paid, equipped, and rewarded by their commanders rather than the state. Military service became a career, and loyalty shifted away from the Republic toward individual generals who promised land and wealth after victory. This change proved catastrophic. Armies were no longer instruments of the state. They became personal tools of ambition. The consequences soon became clear. Rival generals began using their armies to seize power within Rome itself. Civil war erupted between Marius and his former ally, Lucius Cornelius. For the first time, Roman legions marched on Rome, not as defenders, but as conquerors. Sulla emerged victorious and declared himself dictator. Though he eventually resigned, the damage was irreversible. He had shown that force could override law, and that the Republic's institutions could be bent or broken by a determined individual. Fear now dominated Roman politics. Elections were corrupted by bribery. Courts were manipulated. Violence in the streets became common. The Senate still existed, but its authority weakened as ambitious men learned that power came not from tradition, but from control of armies and wealth. Rome was no longer governed by consensus. It was governed by competition. By the early 1st century BC, the Republic was a shell of its former self. Its laws remained, but its spirit had changed. Political life revolved around ambition, rivalry, and survival. The state existed, but loyalty to the state was fading. Out of this chaos emerged a new generation of powerful individuals, men whose personal ambitions would shape the fate of Rome. They were generals, politicians, and masters of public image. And among them was one man whose rise would push the Republic beyond the point of return. His name was Julius Caesar. The Republic had survived wars abroad, but it could not survive unchecked ambition at home. And soon one man would prove that the Republic was no longer strong enough to control its own champions. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic still existed in name, but not in spirit. Its institutions stood, its laws remained. Yet real power no longer flowed through tradition or consensus. It flowed through wealth, influence, and above all, the loyalty of armies. This was the Rome into which Julius Caesar rose. Caesar was not born into greatness. His family was noble, but poor, and in a republic dominated by wealth, that mattered. What Caesar lacked in money, however, he compensated for with ambition, intelligence, and an unmatched understanding of politics. He knew that in a broken system rules could be bent, and that public image could be as powerful as force. In 60 BC, Caesar formed an unofficial alliance that would change Rome forever. Known as the First Triumvirate, it united Caesar with two of the most powerful men in the Republic, Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Each man needed the others. Together they bypassed the Senate and controlled Roman politics from behind the scenes. The Republic was still standing, but it was no longer in control. To build his own power, Caesar needed military glory. He found it in Gaul. Between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar led a series of brutal campaigns that expanded Roman control over modern-day France and beyond. His victories brought immense wealth to Rome, and absolute loyalty from his legions. Caesar did not simply command his soldiers, he inspired them. They fought for him personally, not for the Senate. While Caesar conquered abroad, Rome unravelled at home. The triumvirate collapsed after Crassus was killed in the east, and Pompey aligned himself with the Senate. Fear of Caesar's growing power spread among Rome's elites. They demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar understood what this meant. Without his army, he would be destroyed politically, and possibly killed. In 49 BC, Caesar made a decision that would end the Republic. He led his army across the Rubicon River, the legal boundary beyond which a general was forbidden to bring troops. By doing so, Caesar declared war on the Roman state itself. According to a tradition, he spoke a single phrase that captured the moment. The die is cast. Civil war followed. Pompey fled Italy, and Caesar pursued him across the Mediterranean. Within a few years, Caesar emerged victorious. Pompey was dead. His enemies were defeated, and Rome lay firmly in Caesar's hands. The Republic still existed in form, but in reality, Power now belonged to one man. Caesar did not declare himself king. He understood Roman hatred of monarchy too well. Instead, he accumulated titles and honours, each legal on its own, but together creating absolute authority. He was appointed dictator, first temporarily, then for life. He reformed the calendar, reorganized debt, expanded citizenship, and centralized power around himself. To many Romans, Caesar was a hero who brought stability after decades of chaos. To others, he was a tyrant destroying the Republic's final defenses. Fear returned to Rome, but this time it wore a familiar face. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of senators acted. Believing they were saving the Republic, they assassinated Caesar in the Senate House, stabbing him to death in full view of Rome's political elite. Among them were men Caesar trusted, including Brutus. They believed killing Caesar would restore the Republic. They were wrong. Caesar's death did not save Rome. It shattered it. The assassination removed the man, but not the forces he had unleashed. The Republic no longer had the strength, legitimacy, or unity to reclaim power. Instead of peace, Rome plunged into deeper chaos. Civil war returned, fiercer than before, and from that chaos would emerge something entirely new. The Roman Republic had not survived Julius Caesar, and the Roman Empire was about to be born. They had killed Caesar to save the Republic. Instead, they destroyed its last chance to survive. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not restore the Roman Republic. It destroyed what little stability remained. Rome did not return to law and tradition. It descended into chaos. The men who had killed Caesar believed they had saved the Republic. But instead, they had removed the only figure capable of controlling it. Power no longer belonged to institutions. It belonged to whoever could seize it. In the weeks following Caesar's death, Rome stood divided and uncertain. Into this chaos stepped an unexpected figure, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son. To many he seemed insignificant, young, inexperienced, and physically unimpressive. But Octavian possessed two decisive advantages: Caesar's name and an exceptional understanding of power. Caesar's will named Octavian his heir. That single act changed everything. Octavian moved quickly to claim his inheritance. He used Caesar's legacy to gain the loyalty of veterans and the support of the public. At the same time, Rome's political elite underestimated him, believing they could manipulate the young man. They would soon learn how wrong they were. Another figure dominated Rome in the aftermath of Caesar's death: Mark Antony. A trusted general and ally of Caesar, Antony controlled much of the army and positioned himself as Caesar's true successor. Tension between Antony and Octavian escalated rapidly, pushing Rome toward yet another civil war. For a brief moment, cooperation seemed possible. In 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and a lesser-known general named Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first, this alliance was legal and openly sanctioned by the state. Together, they seized absolute authority. They eliminated political enemies through brutal proscriptions, and they hunted down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi, the forces of Brutus and Cassius were defeated, ending any hope of restoring the Republic. But unity was temporary. As with every alliance in Roman politics, ambition soon replaced cooperation. Lepidus was sidelined, and power was divided between Octavian and Antony. Octavian controlled the western provinces. Antony ruled the east. The Republic still existed in name. but Rome was now effectively ruled by two men. Antony's power base lay in the eastern Mediterranean, where he formed a political and romantic alliance with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. Together they represented a fusion of Roman military power and Eastern wealth. To Octavian, this alliance was an opportunity. He presented Antony not as a Roman leader, but as a traitor corrupted by foreign influence. Through careful propaganda, Octavian convinced the Roman people that Antony planned to abandon Rome in favour of an Eastern monarchy. Fear and resentment spread quickly. In 31 BC, the conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Actium. Octavian's forces defeated the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra in a decisive naval battle. The defeat shattered their power. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, and Egypt fell under Roman control. Octavian now stood alone. For the first time since the fall of the kings, Rome was ruled by a single individual. But Octavian understood Roman history better than anyone. Julius Caesar had seized power openly and paid for it with his life. Octavian chose a different path. In 27 BC, he staged a political performance. He publicly declared that he was restoring authority to the Senate and the Roman people. In return, the Senate granted him extraordinary powers and a new title, Augustus. He was not called king. He was not called dictator. He was called princeps, the first citizen. In reality, Augustus controlled the army, the provinces, the treasury, and the state. The republic still existed in appearance. But its power was gone. Rome had become an empire, without admitting it. Augustus ruled not through fear, but through stability. He ended decades of civil war, reformed administration, secured borders, and reshaped Roman society. To a population exhausted by chaos, peace mattered more than freedom. The Roman Republic had ended quietly, and the Roman Empire had begun. Rome no longer belonged to the Senate, it belonged to an emperor, one who had learned from the Republic's failures and would rule differently than any king before him. When Augustus emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, the empire was exhausted. Decades of civil war had drained its population, shattered its economy, and destroyed faith in political institutions. Romans did not ask for freedom anymore. They asked for peace. Augustus understood this better than anyone. What followed was something the ancient world had never experienced before. The period that began under Augustus would later be known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 2 centuries, large-scale internal conflict disappeared from the empire. This peace was not the absence of violence, but the control of it. Rome did not stop fighting wars. It simply stopped fighting itself. Augustus reshaped the Roman state from the inside. He reorganized the provinces, separating military zones from peaceful civilian regions, to prevent generals from amassing independent power. He placed the legions under direct imperial control and ensured soldiers were paid regularly by the state, not by individual commanders. Loyalty shifted back toward Rome, now embodied in the emperor. At the same time, Augustus restored tradition. Temples were rebuilt, religious rituals revived, and family values promoted. Outwardly, Rome looked like a restored republic. In reality, it was a carefully managed empire. Stability brought prosperity. Roads spread across the empire, connecting distant provinces to Rome itself. Trade flourished as goods moved safely from Britain, Gaul and Hispania to Italy, Greece, and the eastern Mediterranean. Grain from Egypt fed Rome's massive population. Cities expanded. Aqueducts delivered clean water. and Roman law standardized administration across vast territories. For the average Roman citizen, life became more predictable. Taxes were collected efficiently. Justice followed recognizable rules. Order replaced uncertainty. This was the Roman dream. After Augustus's death in AD 14, power passed to his successors. Not all were capable rulers, and some were deeply flawed. Emperors such as Tiberius, Tiberius, and Claudius governed effectively but cautiously. Others, like Caligula and Nero, ruled erratically and violently. Yet the system Augustus built proved resilient. Even bad emperors could not easily destroy it. The reason was simple. The empire was no longer dependent on individual brilliance. It was sustained by institutions, bureaucracy, and habit. Rome had learned how to rule on autopilot. By the late 1st century AD, a new pattern emerged. Emperors were no longer chosen by blood alone. Capable leaders could rise through adoption and merit. This shift strengthened the empire and reduced the chaos of succession. Under emperors like Vespasian and his sons, the Flavian dynasty restored discipline after civil unrest and reaffirmed imperial authority. Massive construction projects symbolized Rome's confidence, including the Colosseum, a monument not just to entertainment, but to imperial power. By AD 96, Rome stood at the height of its stability. Its borders were secure, its economy strong, and its population largely loyal. The empire was vast, diverse, and remarkably functional. To many, it seemed eternal. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were already taking place. Peace brought comfort. Comfort weakened vigilance, and the limits of expansion were beginning to appear. The Roman dream was real, but it carried a hidden cost. Rome had achieved stability, but maintaining peace required constant strength, and soon the empire would learn that even its greatest success had limits. By the end of the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire appeared stronger than ever. Its borders were secure, its economy prosperous, and its institutions deeply entrenched. Yet the stability Rome enjoyed was not accidental. It was maintained by constant vigilance, capable leadership, and an unbroken chain of authority. For a time, Rome found the right balance. After years of unrest, a new principle guided imperial succession: adoption based on merit rather than bloodline. This decision would produce the most effective rulers the empire had ever known. They would later be remembered as the 5 good emperors. Beginning with Nerva in AD 96, the empire entered a period of competent and restrained rule. His successor, Trajan, expanded Rome to its greatest territorial extent. Through careful planning and overwhelming force, Roman legions pushed deep into Dacia and the eastern provinces. Victory brought immense wealth, strengthening the state and reinforcing Rome's belief in its own superiority. But expansion had limits. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, recognized the dangers of endless conquest. He abandoned overextended territories and focused on consolidation rather than growth. Fortifications replaced expansion, most famously in Britain, where Hadrian's Wall marked the northern boundary of Roman power. Rome was no longer growing outward without restraint. It was learning to hold what it already possessed. Under Antoninus Pius, the empire reached a quiet peak. His reign was marked by peace, administrative efficiency, and prosperity. Rarely leaving Italy, Antoninus governed through law and stability rather than spectacle or war. To many Romans, this was the empire at its best: orderly, secure, and predictable. Yet this era of balance depended on a fragile condition: capable emperors. The system worked only as long as the man at the top understood its responsibilities. Power remained absolute, and no institutional safeguard existed to prevent failure. The price of stability was dependence on the emperor's character. That vulnerability became clear under Marcus Aurelius. A philosopher-emperor, Marcus Aurelius ruled with sincerity and restraint. Yet his reign was defined by crisis. Plague swept through the empire, killing millions and weakening the economy. Barbarian invasions intensified along the northern borders, forcing Rome into constant warfare. For years, Marcus Aurelius governed from the front lines, defending the empire from collapse. Rome survived, but barely. When Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180, he broke the principle that had preserved stability. Instead of adopting a capable successor, he passed power to his biological son, Commodus. This decision would have devastating consequences. Commodus lacked discipline, restraint, and respect for governance. He treated the empire as a personal possession, and the throne as a stage. Court politics descended into corruption, paranoia, and spectacle. Authority eroded as loyalty shifted away from the state, toward individuals seeking favor and survival. The illusion of invincibility shattered. Rome had reached the height of its power, but it had also revealed its greatest weakness. An empire governed by absolute authority could function brilliantly under the right ruler and fail catastrophically under the wrong one. The Pax Romana had depended on exceptional leadership. With that chain broken, the cost of empire would soon become impossible to ignore. Rome still appeared strong, but the foundations were beginning to crack, and once the balance was lost, restoring it would prove far more difficult than maintaining it. The death of Marcus Aurelius marked the end of an era. With him died the last emperor whose authority rested on discipline, restraint, and long-term vision. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but something more dangerous: instability without direction. Rome still looked powerful, but it had lost its balance. The reign of Commodus exposed how fragile imperial authority had become. His misrule weakened public trust, encouraged corruption, and undermined the respect once associated with the imperial office. When he was assassinated in AD 192, Rome entered a period of chaos that would define the next century. Power became something to be seized, rather than inherited. The empire descended into a cycle of short reigns, violent successions, and constant civil conflict. Emperors rose and fell not through legitimacy, but through the support of the army. Whoever controlled the legions could claim the throne, at least temporarily. Loyalty shifted rapidly, and the title of emperor became increasingly meaningless. This instability reached its peak during the crisis of the 3rd century. Between AD 235 and 284, Rome saw dozens of emperors, most of whom died violently. Civil wars drained resources and distracted the state from external threats. Provinces broke away, forming short-lived independent kingdoms. At times, the empire existed only in name. Meanwhile, the economy deteriorated. Endless warfare disrupted trade routes and agriculture. To pay soldiers, emperors debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins until trust in money collapsed. Inflation soared, prices became unstable, and ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. Economic confidence, the backbone of imperial stability, eroded rapidly. As Rome struggled internally, its borders came under increasing pressure. Germanic tribes tested the northern frontiers, while Persian forces challenged Rome's eastern provinces. Plagues returned, reducing population and weakening manpower. The army, once Rome's greatest strength, became overstretched and reactive. The empire could no longer respond with the confidence of earlier centuries. Local communities began to rely on their own leaders for protection, rather than distant imperial authority. Loyalty to Rome weakened as survival became a local concern. The idea of a unified empire began to fade from everyday life. Yet Rome did not fall. Despite its fractures, the empire remained too large, too ingrained, and too resilient to collapse entirely. Even in crisis, Roman administration, law, and military tradition endured. What Rome needed was not restoration of the past, but reinvention. That reinvention would come from an unlikely source. In AD 284, a soldier emperor rose to power who understood the scale of Rome's crisis. His reforms would reshape the empire, saving it from immediate collapse, but at a profound cost. His name was Diocletian. Rome had reached the edge of destruction. Survival now demanded radical change, and Rome was about to abandon everything it once believed about power. By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire had survived chaos, but it had not recovered from it. Civil wars, economic collapse, and foreign invasions. They had stripped away the illusion of permanence. The old Roman system, built on tradition, consensus, and civic pride, was no longer enough to hold the empire together. Rome needed to change, or it would disappear. That change began in AD 284, when a hardened soldier named Diocletian seized power. Unlike many before him, Diocletian understood that the empire's problems were structural, not personal. Rome did not need another strongman. It needed a new system. Diocletian redefined what it meant to be emperor. Gone was the image of the emperor as the first citizen. In its place rose the emperor as an absolute ruler, distant and divine. Diocletian presented himself not as a servant of the state, but as its master. Elaborate court rituals, imperial robes, and enforced reverence. They separated the emperor from ordinary life. Power was no longer shared, it was displayed. To govern such a vast empire, Diocletian introduced radical reforms. He divided authority among 4 rulers in a system known as the Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, each responsible for different regions. The empire was not officially split, but power was decentralized to ensure rapid response to threats. For a time, it worked. Borders stabilized, rebellions were suppressed, and administrative efficiency improved. Taxes were reorganized, the army was restructured, and the state regained control over resources. Rome had avoided immediate collapse, but Diocletian's reforms came at a cost. The new system was rigid and authoritarian. Society became tightly controlled. Professions were inherited, movement restricted, and personal freedom reduced in the name of stability. Rome had survived, but it was no longer the Rome of the Republic or early empire. Religion also became a battlefield. Diocletian sought unity through traditional Roman gods. Believing divine favor was essential to imperial survival. Christianity, which rejected the emperor's divinity and Roman religious practices, was seen as a threat. The result was the last and most severe persecution of Christians in Roman history. It failed. Instead of destroying Christianity, persecution strengthened it. After Diocletian retired, the fragile balance of the Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. From this chaos emerged a new ruler, Constantine. In AD 312, Constantine faced his rival Maxentius near Rome. According to later accounts, Constantine experienced a vision before battle, seeing a Christian symbol and hearing the promise that he would conquer in its name. Whether myth or propaganda, the result was real. Constantine won decisively. Constantine understood something profound. Christianity could unify the empire in ways traditional religion no longer could. In AD 313, he legalized Christianity through the Edict of Milan, ending centuries of persecution. Over time, Christianity moved from a marginalized faith to a central pillar of imperial identity. Rome's relationship with the divine had fundamentally changed. Constantine also reshaped the empire geographically. Recognizing the East's wealth and strategic importance, he founded a new capital on the site of Byzantium. Renamed Constantinople, it was designed as a Christian city, fortified, wealthy, and positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Power was no longer centered on Rome itself. The empire was now effectively divided, administratively, culturally, and spiritually. When Constantine died in AD 337, the Roman Empire still stood strong. Its armies remained formidable, its bureaucracy intact, and its faith transformed. But unity was an illusion. The foundations of a permanent division between East and West had been laid. Rome had survived once again, but it had done so by becoming something entirely different. The empire had been saved, but only temporarily, and the changes that preserved Rome would soon reveal which half of the empire could endure, and which could not. When Constantine died in AD 337, the Roman Empire still appeared powerful. Its armies stood guard along vast borders, its cities remained active, and its administration continued to function. But beneath this surface strength, something essential had been lost. Rome no longer believed in itself. The empire Constantine left behind was divided, politically, economically, and culturally. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more urbanized, and better defended. The western half, by contrast, was poorer, more rural, and increasingly dependent on military force it could no longer sustain. Though both halves shared an imperial title, their realities were very different. In the West, authority weakened year by year. Emperors came and went, often elevated by military factions and discarded just as quickly. Many ruled only in name, while real power rested with generals, court officials, or barbarian allies. The imperial office, once the symbol of Roman order, became hollow. At the same time, pressure on the borders intensified. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others did not invade as a single wave. They arrived gradually, often seeking land, protection, or employment within the empire. Rome, lacking manpower, allowed many of them to settle as foederati, allies who fought for Rome in exchange for autonomy. This solution solved short-term problems and created long-term disaster. Loyalty became uncertain. Roman armies increasingly relied on non-Roman soldiers led by their own chiefs. Discipline weakened, coordination failed, and the distinction between Roman and outsider blurred. The empire's military strength now depended on forces it did not fully control. In AD 378, disaster struck at the Battle of Adrianople. A Roman army was annihilated by Gothic forces, and the Emperor Valens was killed in battle. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. For the first time in centuries, Rome had lost a major field army to invaders inside its own borders. Confidence never recovered, Economic decline deepened the crisis, cities shrank, trade networks collapsed, and tax revenues fell. The Western government struggled to pay soldiers and maintain infrastructure. Roads deteriorated, defences crumbled, and local elites withdrew their support from a state that could no longer protect them. Rome became distant, not just geographically, but psychologically. The symbolic heart of the empire suffered repeated humiliation. In AD 410, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. Though the city was no longer the political capital, its fall shocked the Roman world. For centuries, Rome had been seen as eternal. Now, it was vulnerable. More sacks followed. The Vandals captured Rome in AD 455, stripping it of wealth and prestige. Each invasion eroded belief in imperial authority. To many in the West, Rome no longer represented order. It represented decay. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to function. Wealth flowed through Constantinople, administration remained effective, and borders were defended more successfully. The contrast was unmistakable. The empire had not fallen everywhere, only where belief, resources, and cohesion had failed. By the mid-5th century, Western emperors were little more than figureheads. Real power lay with military strongmen who ruled in Rome's name but no longer served its ideals. The state existed, but the idea of Rome as a unifying force was gone. In AD 476, the final act arrived quietly. A Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus. No great battle followed. No final stand was made. The imperial title was simply abolished in the West. The Roman Empire did not collapse in a single moment. It faded. The West had not been conquered so much as abandoned by its leaders, its people, and its faith in Rome itself. Yet this was not the end of Rome. Rome had fallen in the West, but in the East it still lived, stronger, richer, and more determined to endure. When the Western Roman Empire ended in AD 476, many believed Rome had finally fallen. The imperial throne in the West was gone, the legions had disappeared, and the old capital had lost its power. To later generations, this moment became known as the fall of Rome. But Rome did not truly die. In the East, the Roman Empire continued to exist, largely unchanged in its institutions and identity. From its capital at Constantinople, emperors ruled territories that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. To its people, this was not a new state, or a successor empire. It was simply Rome. Modern historians would later call it the Byzantine Empire. But its citizens never used that name. They called themselves Romans, governed by Roman law, protected by Roman armies, and ruled by Roman emperors. For centuries after the fall of the West, the Eastern Roman Empire remained one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the world. Constantinople stood as a fortified, wealthy metropolis, protected by massive walls and commanding vital trade routes between Europe and Asia. While the West fragmented into small kingdoms, the East preserved imperial administration, taxation, and professional armies. Roman law became one of its greatest legacies. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, centuries of Roman legal tradition were collected and systematized into a comprehensive legal code. This body of law would later influence legal systems across Europe and beyond, long after the empire itself had disappeared. The Eastern Empire also adapted culturally. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the dominant language, reflecting the realities of the eastern provinces. Christianity became deeply integrated into state identity, shaping politics, art, and daily life. Rome had changed its appearance, but not its essence. Survival required compromise. Over the centuries, the empire faced relentless challenges: Persian rivals, Arab expansions, internal revolts, and economic pressure. Territory was lost and regained. Power expanded and contracted. Yet time and again, the Eastern Roman Empire adapted rather than collapsed. Unlike the West, it learned how to shrink without breaking. By the late medieval period, the empire was a shadow of its former size, but its capital remained a symbol of continuity. Constantinople preserved classical knowledge, art, and administrative tradition during centuries of upheaval in Europe. In doing so, it acted as a bridge between the ancient and modern worlds. The final chapter came in 1453. That year, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. After weeks of fighting, the city fell. The last Roman emperor died defending its walls. With him ended the longest continuous imperial tradition in human history. Rome had survived for nearly 1500 years, but even then, Rome did not vanish. Its ideas lived on in law, religion, architecture, and political thought. The memory of Rome shaped empires that followed, from medieval kingdoms to modern nations. The Roman world had ended, but the Roman legacy had not. Rome had fallen twice, yet its influence never faded. To understand Rome is not to look backward, but to recognize how deeply it still shapes the present. Rome is gone, its emperors are dust, its legions long dissolved, and its cities reduced to stone and memory. And yet, Rome is everywhere. The modern world is built on Roman foundations, often without realizing it. The idea that law should be written, recorded, and applied systematically comes directly from Rome. Concepts of citizenship, governance, public administration, and legal rights all trace their roots back to Roman thinking. Even the word republic survives, a reminder of Rome's earliest political experiment. Rome also shaped how power is understood. The Romans demonstrated that empires are not sustained by force alone. They are built through systems of law, infrastructure, taxation, and belief. Roads were not just paths for armies. They were tools of control. Cities were not just settlements. They were instruments of Roman identity. Through organization and integration, Rome ruled people who were not Roman and made them part of the empire. But Rome's story is not one of success alone. It is also a warning. Rome teaches us that power, once centralized, becomes fragile, that systems designed to prevent tyranny can be undone by ambition. That stability depends not only on institutions, but on trust, legitimacy, and shared belief. When those disappear, even the strongest empire can weaken from within. The fall of Rome was not caused by a single invasion or a single decision. It was the result of centuries of accumulated choices, political compromises, economic inequality, military dependence, and the gradual loss of civic responsibility. Rome did not collapse because it was attacked. It collapsed because it stopped believing in the values that once sustained it. And yet, Rome endures. Its influence survives in language, architecture, religion, and law. Its memory shaped medieval kingdoms, inspired modern democracies, and continues to inform how societies think about power and governance. Every empire that followed Rome measured itself against it, consciously or not. Rome matters because it was human. It rose through discipline, adaptability, and ambition. It fell through excess, division, and complacency. Its story mirrors the strengths and weaknesses of civilization itself. To study Rome is not to study the past alone. It is to study the patterns of power that continue to shape the present. Empires fall, ideas remain, and in that sense, Rome never truly died.